Question. How many of you sword collectors out there maintain wish lists, right? Lists of swords that one day you hope to be able to obtain and add to your collections. Well, probably most of us. But how many of you have had swords on that list for a really long time? Now, in this case, there's been a sword that's been on my list for, if I'm doing the math right, probably about 18 years now. And for different reasons, I just never pulled the trigger on it. When it first came out and caught my eye, it was kind of out of my budget. And then at other times in my life when it was in my budget, it wasn't necessarily available. But the thing that made me hesitate the most was the question, should I buy it? Well, that's crazy talk, Mike. Of course you should buy a sword that you want. But if you watch my videos, you know I don't just buy swords to collect them. I buy swords to train with them. And I wasn't sure this one would fit me based on my preferences for swords of this type. But showed up in inventory, available at a good price at Sword Buyer's Guide. So I decided to treat myself for 2023 happy aftermath. And yes, I pulled the trigger on the Hanwei Golden Oriole. So, was it worth the wait? Did I make the right choice? Am I happy with the purchase? Or should I have been careful what I wished for? All right. So one of my other justifications for making this purchase was my own curiosity. I wanted to see what current Hanwei quality was like. As I've mentioned in prior videos and shown you in prior reviews, about 18 years ago I first acquired a basic practical katana from them, which I really loved, but it's pretty simple, not fancy whatsoever, and a little bit rough. And it was one of their early releases of that model. After that, I got the Practical Plus and the Practical Pro, which is a monster, but I never invested in any of their higher-end swords. They've been on my wish list, and I would consider the Golden Oriole as kind of mid-range in terms of price, and it's also one that's available as a die show. When that one came out, it came out kind of with the original Hanwei Musashi set, which is kind of an O-katana, as what I would consider its opposite number. But it was the Golden Oriole that caught my eye and apparently kept it. But it has changed over time, and if you look at older reviews, you'll see some differences in, well, we'll talk about those. But let's start with, is it sharp? When speaking of quality. This is some really fine notebook paper. All right, how about some cardboard? Yeah. Now, it has been raining pretty much constantly for months. And I did take it actually out in the rain and cut up some boxes because I really wanted to see how it worked. And we'll talk about that in handling, but it does cut pretty much as expected. Let's talk about the specs. Okay, let's talk specs, and then we'll talk about fit, finish, build quality for a current generation Hanwei product in the mid-range. And then we'll definitely talk about handling. And I will be looking down at my notes for this section because, as I've mentioned in recent videos, I am trying to be less American by giving you metric as well as imperial units, starting with the blade. It is a Shinogi Zukiri profile with a full bohei, pretty standard length for a lot of reproductions these days. 27 inches, about 68.5 centimeters as measured from the habaki, but I do need to point out that this habaki is about 1/8 of an inch, about 5 or 6 millimeters shorter than a lot of my other reproductions. So that does take a shave off the overall length of the blade and will play into the point of balance equation. Distal taper from about 6 millimeters down to about 4. But we have to talk about the giant tsuka in the room. because this is the biggest, no pun intended, reason that I hesitated so long on purchasing this. As I mentioned in previous videos, my personal preference for training is much shorter. I prefer a shorter tsuka. I'm used to a gunto that has maybe a 9-inch, maybe a 10-inch tsuka. In an uchigatana, I prefer something around 11. So yeah, this is more than 3 inches longer than my comfort zone. So how does that play into handling, at least in my head, with my experience? Well, we'll definitely talk about that. But a couple of other surprises down here. I wasn't expecting this much girth, at least in terms of front to back. It is about 1/8 of an inch wider this way than a lot of my other reproductions, but it's not fatter this way necessarily. So that makes the way it fills the hand a bit different, especially with my stubby fingers, but not uncomfortably so. Talk about handling again soon. Another big surprise, and this is a pleasant one. Hanwei has a reputation for what a lot of people refer to as the axe handle tsuka. Straight, chunky, like a piece of lumber. This one has a really nice taper in wasting, though. I was not expecting that, so that's a nice touch. What about the weight? All right, so for a blade of this profile with a bohea of this length, I usually expect these swords to weigh about 2 pounds, 3-4 ounces. This weighs 2 pounds 6, so about 1,077 grams, and I think that extra weight is in the tsuka. Because point of balance, again, a blade of this particular length and profile with a bohea, I do expect the point of balance usually to be about 3.5, 3 3/4, 4 inches. This one is 2 3/8 from, again, that shorter habaki, so about 6 centimeters. If you've seen my video where I talked about trying to give swords a tip score in terms of how much blade presence and feel they have, my balancing point for a Japanese style sword is an 8. Anything slightly above that, definitely much more blade weight, blade presence for cutting. Anything slightly below that, and we're talking about half a point to a point below that, definitely feels a lot faster in hand. So if you're doing kata, iai, something like that, that's a good score. Yeah, this one's 5.5. Way down there for a sword like this. So yes, we're definitely going to talk about how that feels and moves in hand, but let's talk about fit and finish. Okay, so let's talk about fit, finish, build quality, value for the money, starting with the saya. And I do have to start with a little bit of noise down here. It's not terrible, but it's there. Now, up here at the Koiguchi, it's nice and snug. They actually do send a warning card in the box to expect that there's going to be a couple of millimeter gap in there. Better to have it start too tight than too loose, and to please not force it down and risk breaking your Koiguchi. Now, training with this for about a week or so now, it fits in pretty good, and one of the things you'll notice is there's a nice symmetry in the transition between the Koiguchi and the Fuchi, which I think is why this is a little bit wider here than some of the other reproductions that I'm used to. But after about a week, I feel a good balance in retention versus having a positive thumb brake that I don't have to fight. Now, it's not running on buttered glass rails, but there are no obvious flaws. It's not bad. Speaking of not bad, let's talk about the lacquer. Yes, it does show fingerprints, but one of the small reasons I hesitated on buying this was I was afraid I was going to get something garishly neon blue that I wouldn't like, but this is kind of a Prussian blue, very similar to my Musashi Umegami, which I also like, and maybe one day we'll have a comparison of blue swords. One small letdown, the Sageo is just basic cheap leftover Ito. Nothing fancy there, but the saya does have horn parts. So the Kojiri, the Koiguchi, and the Kurigata are horn. Speaking of the Koiguchi, it's pretty well shaped. So I feel like for this price range, it's about what I would expect. And let's just talk about that real quick. If you've been following Hanwei prices, they've gone up over the decades, and they certainly have much higher end offerings. This would be something I'd consider in about their medium range, price-wise. I've seen the MSRP on this float up towards $1,000 US. I picked it up for about $710 at Sword Buyer's Guide. I'll put the link down in the description below if you want to check it out. Maybe it'll still be in stock, maybe still for that price, maybe even for a better price. Who knows? Shop around. But looking at the sword, do I feel like I got my money's worth? All right, this might go a little bit long, but there's a lot to cover here when we talk about the fit, finish, build quality of the sword. And there's a couple of things that are impressive and a couple of things that made me go, Hanwei? All right, let's start on the friendly end, and we'll talk about the Ito. Similar to the Saya, I was a little worried that the color scheme might be too garish, but this is actually a darker blue than I expected. It's a darker blue than my Musashi Umegami. It's kind of a darker Prussian blue. And maybe, again, one day we'll compare blue swords. Tight, but the diamonds are not very even. They do, yeah, they're kind of sloppy. Now, it feels like a cotton. It might be some kind of silk blend or synthetic or something like that, but it's got kind of a cotton feel, but it's not all fuzzy like some of the cheaper Musashi swords are. It does have Hishigami, the little paper triangles that shape the diamonds, but I'll put some close-up shots. There's a couple of places where I wish they wouldn't. It actually sticks out through the laces, and it's kind of lumpy. It almost looks like they shove spit wads in there. I'm like, yeah, this might have actually been better if you just didn't bother, because you didn't do a terribly good job with it, and that is something that does bother me about the wrap. So I mentioned it does have a nice taper in shape, and there are nice transitions between the Ito and the Fuchi and the Kashira. Slight ledge at the Fuchi, but it's barely detectable. Very smooth transition with the Kashira, which has stayed nice and tight. The knots are good. The Same underneath is actually very nice. It, on one side, has kind of small-ish, but not super small nodules. On the other side, though, it's got some pretty big ones. So, not necessarily a line of emperor nodes visible, but some pretty good size nodules. Now, the Fuchi and the Kashira and the Tsuba, all of the fixtures have changed over the generations of this sword. There used to be a solid Tsuba that was more copper. These are described as being blackened brass, so they're not iron, and it does follow that same theme that they started the Golden Oriole series, where you've got a mantis pursuing a cicada, which is in turn being pursued by a larger predator, the oriole. So the castings are pretty good on this current iteration of the Kashira. You've got the mantis, and you'll notice what they did across the board is they left the eyes bright gold, which I think is just a little weird. It's kind of like those cartoons where you'd only see the eyes in the dark kind of a thing. On the Fuchi, it's smooth on one side, and on one side you've got just the cicada. And then on the Tsuba, which is now a cutout design, very textured, you've got the oriole pursuing the mantis, pursuing the cicada. And again, they made the eyes gold. But no hot spots, though. I always worried with Tsubas like this that there's going to be jagged bits that are going to snag my hands, but so far that hasn't been a problem. Now, the Manuki are left bright brass gold and they do follow that theme, but I wish they would have antiqued them, because for me the bright gold in contrast looks just a little bit cheap. Let's talk about the Nakago. I'll put up some pictures. It's pretty well done, has some nice file marks, it is engraved. But, double pin, pay attention to where the lower pin is. The Nakago only extends about an inch past, so it only goes to here, which means this part of the tsuka is not reinforced by having metal, a tang in it. This could potentially be a failure point in a tsuka because of the amount of torque you tend to put on your lower hand. How do we know that? Because it's an issue in traditional Japanese swords. It's pretty common that the Nakago only goes maybe 2/3 of the way into the tsuka. It's also why a lot of people who practice harder cutting Bato Jutsu adopt a hand position with your hands closer and are really conscious as to not only the condition of your tsuka, but where your hands are in terms of supporting the Nakago that's inside. So be aware of that. It's not full tang. On the other hand, if I ever decided I wanted to cut this down, I would only have to cut down the tsuka and not the nakago. So that's also nice. If it becomes a problem, I will update this video and let you know. All right, blade itself. It is pretty plain brass habaki, but it fits well and it has nice rounded edges, so you don't get that hang-up ledge thing when you're sheathing it. So that's nice. The blade is actually very well shaped and finished. It's a little bit narrower front to back than I would expect from a lot of reproductions, but not bad. Hanwei does tend to go for the cloudy hamon presentation versus having the hamon brighter than the rest of the sword, so that's something to consider. It does have a pronounced geometric yokote, which is nice. Decent polishing job. I'm assuming it's probably a machine polish versus a hand polish, but it's not garishly mirror polished or blobby. The bohi are very crisp. Now, one very interesting thing to look at is how far up into the tip that the bohi goes. I'm used to it stopping about right there. This it's a very short kasaki, and the bohi goes, it almost feels like maybe the bohi used to go further and it just got shaped out, but no, it does bevel up at the ends there, and it's fairly well done and even on both sides. Now, one weirdness that I've discovered that seems to be across at least all of the examples of Hanwei swords that I have is, I don't know if you can see it, but yeah, starting right there, you see that line? From there up, the finish on the mune is really rough, like sandpaper rough, like just came off a grinding wheel rough. Now, I've seen this kind of odd transition, like I said, on other Hanwei swords. It's been visible, but not very tactile. This is incredibly tactile. When I am doing no-toe, it grabs my hand. And maybe that's why it's there. All right. Let's talk about handling then. All right. A quick, but I feel necessary digression before we get into the handling of this particular sword. I'll try to keep it brief. And if you want more on this particular topic, let me know in the comments and I'll try to devote a separate video to it. But the topic is, okay, what's the deal with the long tsuka? What is it good for? What are the advantages and what are the potential disadvantages? Now, caveats as always, I don't consider myself any kind of master expert, anything like that, but I have spent decades training in Japanese-style swordsmanship, so I have my preferences, and my preferences include shorter tsuka. So this is definitely a change for me. I'm outside my comfort zone. Now, your school, your style, or your personal preferences might prefer longer or shorter or somewhere in between. Or related weapons. Maybe you're in HEMA studying longsword and you're working with one that has an extra long hilt like a montante. Or maybe you're training with a miao dao or something that has a really long grip. Let me know in the comments what your experiences are and your preferences. Or different kind of weapon sort of entirely. Staff weapon, polearm. This is a Joe medium length staff that if you're used to striking and parrying and thrusting with the hands, well, certainly wider than they would be on your average two-handed sword, you learn certain things about what this will do for you in terms of stability, how to move it around, how to strike with it, how to use the distance between your hands in different ways. But it's certainly a different cutting, striking stroke than it would be for a sword with your hands closer together. How does that play in here? Well, let's start with the carry. Now, this isn't a no-dachi, so the blade length, and therefore the saya length, it's a pretty standard length for me. It's pretty familiar. So any kind of entanglement, collision, tripping hazards I've got back here, they're the same. Also, that doesn't affect my draw stroke. So when I'm drawing the sword, it's comfortable length. It's not a no-dachi. Now, a couple of things, though, with this longer tsuka. First of all, and this is kind of unexpected, until I actually had it in my belt, I didn't think about this. Overall length of the weapon and then the ratio of where it is in my belt, it feels like there's just too much of the sword north of the obi, like I don't have it in far enough. Like if you practice EI with a lot of sayabiki, where you start by extending the saya forward from the obi, it's almost like this is where I'm wearing it. And I feel like it needs to be a couple inches that way. So it's just a little odd. But yeah, there's definitely more on this end that could potentially be an entanglement collision risk as you're moving around, depending on what you're doing. I would also have to say tactically, it's a little bit closer to your enemy if he tries to grab it. But, you know, small thing. Wearing it up here retracted close to the body, which allows you to move around without that saya tripping hazard. I'm used to having that pommel here. Now what I'll do is I'll put up a couple of pictures comparing this sword to the Musashi Umegami, and it's not just to compare color schemes, but so you can see that 11.5-inch, pretty standard length for reproduction tsuka that I'm pretty comfortable with compared to this one that's 3 inches longer. And yeah, it's up here above my, it's almost to my jaw in many ways, and it's also sort of in my visual field, so it's kind of distracting. But in application, all right, again, not a master expert, but if you're familiar with Japanese style swordsmanship. Okay, when we talk about handling, we will talk about how this works in one hand. And in one hand, having a long hilt down here, if you're familiar with Thai or Burmese da that have really long handles, but they're usually used one-handed. Yeah, the counterbalance here, it's definitely accentuated. But we'll talk about that more in the handling of this sword in a second. Two hands, though. In Japanese-style swordsmanship, one of the things that you learn is that the hands have different roles to play, especially in good cutting mechanics. That there is indeed power in the right hand, but a lot of the right hand's job is to control and guide, maneuver the sword, where the left hand and the core provides the leverage. Now, when you've got your hands up closer, they feel like they're working more as a unit. When you spread them out, it separates those jobs, so you feel what each one is doing much more, well, individually. So, would that make this then a good training tool to develop those particular skill sets, those, shall we say, hand rolls? I would say that's an interesting application for having a sword like this in your arsenal. But definitely something to get used to. I certainly could just simply choke up, right, and put my hands where I'm used to having them. It's not a big deal, but then I do have a little bit of weird thing that I'm not used to sticking out here. How much does it actually tangle me up as I'm moving the sword around, though? Now, one thing you're going to notice is I do kind of cheat. If I get into some of those cross-arm positions, my hand will naturally slide up just a little bit. But, yeah, I was expecting a little bit more of a collision hazard with my body, but I'm not getting it. All right, how does this sword feel? All right, something that it struck me that I should add is if you're into kendo, for instance. Now, I've had very minimal experience with kendo, very little training, but the proportions of the shinai and the length of that particular tsuka and the kind of striking, cutting mechanics that you develop with that weapon, yeah, this might be a very familiar thing to you if you're a kendoka. So just that's something to consider. But this particular sword, I talked about the weight versus the point of balance and then the leverage differences. Okay, let's start just with one hand. One hand, I do train one and two-handed in Japanese style swordsmanship. And I also do a lot of cross-training with HEMA that we talk about in other videos. So, yes, using the sword in one hand, there is a lot more down here that is, well, it's not really that much in the way. Like I said, if you're familiar with something like a Burmese da or something like that, having a long tsuka south of the hand is going to be a familiar thing to you. But because of the point of balance, the counterbalance, this thing moves really quickly in one hand. The downside of that is I don't necessarily feel like I've got a lot of blade presence. So when it comes to cutting, yeah, it's kind of a light blade. It's not a flimsy blade. It's not flexible or floppy. And cutting is, well, it's been raining. I did actually take it out in the rain. There's a little bit of schmutz still on the blade. Cut up some boxes, and it performed as expected. No better or no worse than other reproduction swords that I have. But I expected, I guess, to be a little bit more surprised, like it would be really, really different, and it's not. Now, putting two hands on this, again, I could certainly cheat, and I do sometimes slide my hand up and down a little bit. That's just a thing that I do. But I find myself pretty quickly getting used to having my hands this far apart, and as a training tool, it's kind of interesting. Now, when it comes to quickness of being able to move this blade, if I'm doing really short actions, yeah, this longer handle is excellent for that. For bigger cutting actions, yeah, I'm having to move bigger. But then I have to do that when I'm using bigger swords like a big long sword or something like that. So it's not totally unfamiliar. And if you train with something like that or something like a Miao Dao, yeah, this is probably going to be pretty familiar to you. But yeah, this sword feels incredibly light and maneuverable, yet, well, comfortingly stable, let's call it that. So, bottom line, do I feel like, well, taking this off my wish list was a good move? Was it worth the money I spent? I'm going to say absolutely. I'm going to say I'm really glad I did. Despite some of the little minor, like what the heck is going on down here with the Ito wrapping, I could fix that if I really wanted to. I was thinking I would have to totally reshape this tsuka because it was going to be an axe handle. I don't feel like I have to do that at all. Even though it's a little wider than I'm used to, it feels pretty good. I'm getting used to it pretty quickly. It's an interesting blade. It's not quite what I'm used to, but it's not a bad thing. So, if you have any questions about this, or similar swords, or if you have this sword or similar swords, or maybe an earlier generation of this sword. Matthew Jensen just did a review of an earlier generation of this sword. Talk about some good timing. Definitely check out his video. But yeah, I think for the money, Hanwei did pretty darn well. I would certainly consider them a company worth considering, worth buying from in the future. And yeah, Mike's been shopping and adding things to his wish list. But until next time, as always, thanks for watching, following me on my journey, subscribing to the channel, liking the videos, adding to our conversation in the comments, friendships we've developed, the conversations we've had. I can't thank you enough. And I hope to see you back for, well, wherever this new year takes me.